Welcome back to the daily Living Jewish Kitzur Shulchan Aruch class. We have been learning through the laws of brachos. Most definitely a most appropriate way to bring brachos into our lives. Excuse the pun. Let's start with a very brief revision of what we were learning before Pesach up until a week before or two before Pesach, and then we will approach the halachas that we are learning at the moment. So if one was to look at the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch from a bird's eye view, this particular page that I'm sharing right now is not actually in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It's my own way that I've summarized it all, but it's pretty much the cycle of life from a Jewish perspective. These are general categories that we work through as we go through the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And as you see, we are about halfway through the different topics where we've gone through most of the day. And once we reach the end of section I, and we've reached a cycle of 24 hours, then we move on to the week, and then the months, and then life, cycles, family, and then deal with some other monetary problems that may come up, and finally sick and mourning. And that is the cycle of life as it is covered in the Shulchan Aruch and in the abbreviated Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. So we started right at the beginning, and we were going through the different sections, and right now we are going through the section on blessings. So if you look back here, the section on blessings has in it about 15 chapters. We've started by talking about hamotzi and mezaidas on bread and other types of gluten foods or foods with grains. We spoke all about wine, and now we're talking about pretty much anything that we eat or drink and how to make a bracha before we eat or drink. And so a brief summary, we spoke about how when you eat without making a bracha, it is like you are eating food of the altar of the temple that is holy and doesn't belong to us because everything is God's. And it's only when we make a bracha that we are issued permission and the ability to elevate and be enriched by the food that we eat. And if you're not sure what bracha to make and it cannot be determined, then one would say the bracha Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shehakol niyah b'dvarai. You should have the item in hand before you make the bracha. If it was lost after making a bracha, then you might need to make another bracha when you get a replacement, even if that's a few seconds later. We spoke about not making any interruption or speaking until you swallow. So if somebody, you're sitting by the dinner table and you make a bracha on your food and somebody asks you a quick question, where do you park the car or where are the keys? Or someone's at the gate, can you get it? So you shouldn't say anything until you've swallowed the food that's in your mouth. Tasting doesn't require a bracha, not if you're not swallowing. Medicines and water, which unless the water is being drunk for thirst or for taste, does not require a bracha. What else did we say? And then we continued by saying, what happens if you forgot to make a bracha and you realized after you already put the food in your mouth? So we said that you move it to the side of your mouth if possible, or you remove it if possible. And finally, in the last two halachas, 11 and 12, we spoke about what happens if you're eating different foods all with the same bracha, or you're eating different foods with different brachas. So let's pick up from there. Go back just slightly to halacha 11. Practically speaking, how do you make a bracha on food when you have different foods in front of you? If you have any questions along the way, please feel free. This is a live class. It lends itself to being interactive if you so desire. So if you have in front of you two different types of food, but both subject to the same bracha. For example, you have a nut and an apple. By the way, nuts grow on trees. So the bracha on a nut would be Barei Pri Ha'etz. Blessed are you, God, our King of the blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the world, who created fruits of the tree. So this a bracha on a almond or on an apple would be the same, with the exception of peanuts. Peanuts are considered a vegetable in the way they grow. They don't grow on regular trees. But all other nuts would be ha'etz. So you're eating two very different types of fruits, but they both grow on trees. So then you would make one bracha that would cover them both. You'd say Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam va'orah pri ha'etz, and you would have in mind, and whether you did or didn't, you would cover both the apple and the almond. Okay, you wouldn't be allowed to make a separate bracha on each. You might say, look, I want to bring a lot of brachas into my life, so I'll make one bracha on the apple. I'll make one bracha on my first bite and another bracha on the second bite. That definitely you can't do. But even if you'll say, I'll make one bracha on the apple and I'll make another bracha on the almond, also doesn't work. As long as different foods are able to be, are generally included in, as long as the different foods require the same bracha, then you just make one bracha for all of them together. Because if you're going to say more brachas, you're making an unnecessary bracha, which is actually disrespectful. So now, which food should you make the bracha on? On whichever is superior, whichever is the main food. So if you're eating an apple and then just a little bit of almonds on the side, then you'd probably make the bracha on the almonds rather than on the apple rather than the almonds. So again, if you're having different foods and they all require the same bracha, so you're making the bracha on all of the foods, but the food that you hold in your hand is what you're originally making the bracha on, and from there it spreads to all the other foods. As I mentioned before, bracha needs to have a landing. So there's the original landing, which is the first food you eat after you make the bracha. Once you eat that food, and as you hold that food in your hand while you make the bracha lands, and then it spreads to all the other foods. And what the Shulchan Aruch is saying is that when you are eating different foods that all have the same bracha, then hold the food in your hand, or the fork in your hand, with the food that is most important. And that will make the bracha more honorable. John, I see that as long as I'm looking at you, I won't go over time. So that's a fringe benefit. With the time right behind you. So I'll try to behave.
Okay.
But if you on that note, if I ever do go over time, and it's happened more than once, then maybe it's a good sign, because maybe it means I'm excited about this year, but it's not unexcusable. So you could send me a chat message just as a reminder. You could just put it in the chat, and then I'll know that it's time to take a break. Okay. So far we're speaking about eating different foods that all require the same bracha. And we're saying that you should make the bracha on the more honorable foods. Now that's unless, if I'm not mistaken, that's unless you specifically want to eat the foods in another order. If you want to eat the foods in another order, you can eat it in the order that you want. Meaning, if you want to first have apples and only afterwards have almonds, or the other way around, you want to first have almonds and only afterwards have apples, then you would make the bracha on whatever you're eating first. But if you're planning on, if you want to eat them both, and it doesn't really make a difference which one you eat first, then you should make it the bracha on the more prominent food, and it will land on that food, and then it will spread to all the other foods of the same brachas. Have in mind that it covers all the other foods of the same brachas. He says, in fact, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says that if you made the bracha on an inferior food, then it actually won't work for a more superior food. This was surprising to me, and I looked it up at greater length, and I saw in other sources. There's an argument about this, different opinions on the matter. So practically, we don't rule as is written over here in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is why it's worth having this class. If you read it inside, you wouldn't have the bottom line. The bottom line today is, even if you made a bracha on the inferior type of food, you would not need to make another bracha on the better food, as long as they are both the same bracha. However, it certainly is better to make the bracha on the superior food first. And I would say, even if you prefer to have the inferior food, you should probably, I'm not sure, but possibly you should rather say the bracha on the, no, let me correct myself. Sorry if this is getting a little complicated. I'll try to keep it simple. If you want to eat the inferior food first, just have in mind when you make the bracha that the bracha is going on both. It's going on both the almonds and on the apples. Okay, until now we're speaking about different foods that all require the same bracha. The example we gave was fruits of the tree. So you're eating almonds and you're eating fruits and you're eating avocados, whatever it is that grows on a tree, they all require one bracha, so you make one bracha for them all. That was in halacha 11. In halacha 12, we now speak about different foods that each require different brachas. So you're eating both avocado and tomatoes. So the avocados grow on a tree and they require the bracha that concludes Borei Pri Ha'etz, creator of the fruits of the tree. And the tomatoes grow on the ground. They require the bracha Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam Borei Pri Ha'adama. Blessed are you, Hashem, who creates fruits of the ground. So now that you've been eating foods requiring different brachas, how do we go about it? So if you have two kinds of fruits, for example, a fruit of a tree and a fruit of the earth, or food over which the bracha shahakal should be said, so you're eating avocado and tomatoes and mushrooms. I don't know if I discussed it at length before, but believe it or not, mushrooms do not grow from the ground. They grow underground, but not from the ground. Mushrooms could grow out of metal, they could grow out of wood, because they don't actually grow from the earth, they grow from other stuff. I don't know exactly what it's called. They just found wherever they found. So the bracha on a mushroom is actually not called a vegetable halachically. A mushroom would be the same as a piece of meat or anything that the bracha is shahakal. It's not considered from the ground. So you have in front of you a avocado, and you have in front of you a slice of avocado, a slice of tomato, and you have in front of you a mushroom, or a cup of coffee, a cup of water. So you have three foods that each require their own brachas, three different brachas. The one food's bracha is thanking Hashem for fruits of the tree, ha'etz. The other fruit's bracha is for fruits of the ground, adama. And the third fruits or vegetables food is of shahakal, which is brachas on anything else that's not from the tree or from the ground. So how do you go about it? So although in theory, had you said the bracha shahakal, we learned previously, shahakal diyamid varai means that everything was made by his word. And we said that in theory, if you made the bracha shahakal, it's all inclusive. If you had in mind that that would cover your avocado and your tomato and your mushroom, everything would be included by that bracha. However, at the outset, that's not the correct way to go about it. Just as when you're leaving the host, if you just said thank you for everything, it would include both the chicken and the wine and the comfortable seats and whatever else. It works, but at the outset, you shouldn't just say thank you for everything. You should say thank you and specify what it is you're thanking the person for. Same thing with brachas. At the outset, you should not say shahakol diyamid varai. If you did, it would work, but that's not the way you should set it up. So, initially, you should say the appropriate bracha for each kind. So, if you're gonna eat both that avocado and that tomato, meaning both the fruit of the tree and the fruit of the ground, first make a bracha on the fruit of the tree, and then make a bracha on fruit of the ground. Why? Because if you're going to say, thank you Hashem for fruits of the ground, well, trees also grow on the ground. So it might sound like when you're making the bracha on fruits of the ground, it might sound like not only are you having in mind the tomatoes, but you're having in mind the avocados too. So therefore, start by saying the bracha that is most specific, and then continue by saying the bracha that's more general, and then continue by saying the bracha that's more general. So you first make a bracha on the fruits of the tree, which is most specific. It's not just from the ground, it's from the tree. And then more generally on fruits of the ground, which generally goes in vegetables, and more generally shahakal on any other foods. Even if you have wine and grapes in front of you, and wine and grapes are obviously very similar. Wine comes from grapes, and the brachas are even more similar, because the bracha we make on wine is fruits of the vine. So you might think that if I make a bracha of fruits of the vine, surely it shouldn't just include Borei Pri Hagafen means creator of fruits of the vines. If you're saying a Borei Pri Hagafen, you'd say, well, that's not just going to cover the wine, it will also cover the grapes. No, says halacha. Since the rabbis instituted that the bracha on grapes is like every other fruit, you would say two brachas. You would say on the grapes a bracha Borei Pri Ha'etz, thank you for fruits of the tree, and then you would say a bracha Borei Pri Hagafen on the wine. So you don't want to group foods into one bracha if the rabbis instituted different brachas for each of those foods. Although in theory they can be grouped, you'd rather have as many brachas in your life as you can. And so that rather than making one bracha on them all, you'll make a specific bracha for each one. But you might wonder, why is the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen, why doesn't that include grapes? When the rabbis originally instituted the blessings, surely if you're making a bracha of fruits of the vine, that should cover grapes. Anybody know the answer? It's because when the rabbis made, if I remember correctly, when the rabbis instituted blessings, they wanted the bracha to be made on the food in its ultimate form. So grapes are delicious, but the real shevach, the real praise of the vine is its wine. Vines are grown much more for wineries than they are for the grapes. So Borei Pri Hagafen is a special bracha that's made on the grape in its ultimate form, which is when it's made into grape juice or wine. And so I think if I remember correctly, that's why Borei Pri Hagafen, thank you for fruits of the vine, that's specifically on grape juice or wine. But if you're just having a grape, then that would be like any other fruit or any of the other 7 species or 5 species that are growing trees, and you'd say the regular bracha Borei Pri Ha'etz. Okay,